All right, let's start with a question from Johnny Stein. How do I respond to this? How do you know you have the right version of Christianity? The Catholic Bible was assembled much closer to the time of Jesus, and yet your church just took books out of the Bible that it liked. If an all-powerful God can't maintain the truth over time, he probably isn't real. There's a few questions in there.
Well, this kind of question really annoys me. At first, it sounded like it was coming from a Roman Catholic, but now it sounds like it's coming from a skeptic who is saying, look, you guys can't even agree about your own books. And therefore, what kind of God is that? All right. Well, when you study the history of the canon, you find something entirely different than what was just described there. In fact, I know this in recent memory because I wrote an article about it last year on Solid Ground that's available on our website. The title is New Testament Canon, Which Books and Why? And they specifically deal with, after I lay out the criterion that the New Testament, that the early Christians implicitly used, or explicitly used actually, to determine which books were God's books. And the wording is important here because the canon is not an authoritative list of books. Like some authority said, here's the right books. But it's a list of authoritative books. In other words, the early church recognized which books had the inherent authority in them. And that wasn't hard because before books were written, they understood that the guide and rule canon for the early church were the apostles that Jesus had personally trained and sent out to represent him. They were the canon. They were in charge. Once they died, anything that they had written was in the category, was at least in the running for the authority. So in a certain sense, the apostles, Jesus and the apostles have always been the authority. The question was, which things do we have now that have survived early church, first century, that were written by apostles and carry that same authority with them? And so that was the main criterion. And another criteria was a sense, what they called catholicity. Now, this is Catholic small c. In other words, it was commonly accepted by all of the players that particular books had vested in them certain authority. So if a book was, or an epistle or whatever was clearly Pauline, Paul, or Johannine, John, or Petrine, Peter, well, it was canon. And that's why by the end of the first century, more than 20 of the books, at least 20, were already acknowledged by everybody to be authoritative canon. And the ones that were left, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation, Book of Hebrews, a couple of others, 1st, 2nd Peter, it's because they weren't entirely sure about the authorship. But once they hammered this out, they came to a conclusion based on common consensus. That's Catholicity. That's the third requirement for canon. And I detail this all in the article. And then they had a clear list of everything that they all acknowledged. But what about these extra books by the Roman Catholics? Those books were not affirmed by the entire church. This is called the apocrypha. First of all, they're Jewish documents written between the time of Malachi and John the Baptist, the intertestamental period. And the Jews did not acknowledge these books as canon. These were not God-inspired in their mind. Okay, first step. Secondly, when these books were discussed, you have Augustine in favor of them and Jerome against them. Now, these are two major leaders in the church. And you could, I mean, those are the ones that come immediately to mind, but there were, the breakdown was 50-50, different people on either side. In other words, there was not a consistent affirmation from the early church that the so-called apocrypha was God-inspired. In other words, it did not satisfy the test of Catholicity, which is one of the vital tests of canon. All right. What's really curious, though, is when you get all the way to the 16th century and the Council of Trent, when the Roman Catholic Church officially canonized the Apocrypha. 1/3 of all the priests who voted against it. 1/3 of all the priests voted against it. So it was a 2/3 majority, but it ought to be significant that even in the Roman Catholic Church, there wasn't a unified voice.
And that long amount later.
Yeah, 1,500 years later. And so when I hear things like the Protestant took these books out of the Bible, this that reflects a complete ignorance about how the process took place. And there was also the intimation that the Roman Catholic Church was the one who put the original list together. There was no Roman Catholic Church the first 400 years. There just wasn't. There was no supremacy of Rome. At the Council of Nicaea, Rome had two. That was 325. Rome had two representatives, just like every other region had two. And there were like 300 and some total representatives. They had no special say. That Bishop of Rome had no role at all in the most important early council of the church, the Council of Nicaea. If you go back to the first council, which is the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, Peter's there. He gives his say-so, but so does Paul, and so does Barnabas. And then the final conclusion is regarding that was all done by James, the brother of Jesus. So James presided over that, not Peter. So you don't have any real history like is intimated here in this passage. And a lot of Roman Catholics actually state this, but that isn't the way it worked out. It just isn't. And I chronicle all of that in the piece, Solid Ground, that I wrote last year. New Testament canon, which books and why.
So what would you say to this last line here? If an all-powerful God can't maintain the truth over time, he probably isn't real.
Well, he did. He did maintain the truth over time. It doesn't mean you don't have naysayers or people say false things. The truth of God is evident. Here you got a skeptic that says intimates there is no God. Okay, you're going to have human beings that go south. It doesn't mean God is incapable, because God doesn't. He doesn't cause everything to happen in a machine-like way. Oh, God's really powerful, so nobody's allowed to dissent. Nobody, fallen human being, can have a different view. There can't be any debates about this. No, there are debates about it. The end result, though, I think, is the canon that God secured. But there's a process that goes on. Why is that a flaw of God's?